The sun ascended over Beverly Hills, bathing the quiet streets in a warm, golden light. Clint Eastwood was at his kitchen table, enjoying a freshly brewed coffee. The room was filled with its rich aroma. The house felt eerily still, a stark contrast to the previous night's chaos. The police had arrested the burglars, and the media frenzy had calmed following Clint's brief press statement. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but Clint felt the difference. His body was sore from the night's ordeal, a sharp reminder that he was no longer the young man he once was. Yet, the persistent fire within him, that unyielding resolve that had always defined him, burned as fiercely as ever. Gazing at the slightly worn baseball bat in the corner, he knew the battle was far from over. He could sense it deep in his bones. A sudden, sharp knock on the door snapped him from his reverie. Clint placed his coffee down and made his way to the door with deliberate, steady steps. Upon opening it, he was greeted by a stranger in a sleek black suit, his face unreadable. "Mr. Eastwood," the man began smoothly, "last night was quite the spectacle. Honestly, I didn't expect such resilience from a 94-year-old. Clint's gaze narrowed. He recognized the type immediately. Not a cop, not a journalist, but something more sinister. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The man smirked slightly. "Merely a messenger. The individuals you dealt with last night? They weren't mere thugs. They're employed by someone who isn't pleased about being humiliated." Clint crossed his arms and leaned against the door frame. "If you think you're here to scare me, you'd better think again and start running," he retorted. The man chuckled lightly. "It's not a threat, just a warning. Vincent Caruso. Perhaps you've heard of him? He wants you to know that this isn't the end. You've made him look foolish, and that's something he cannot abide." Clint was familiar with the name. Vincent Caruso was a notorious figure in the criminal underbelly of Los Angeles, known for controlling illegal activities from gambling to loan sharking and high-stakes burglary. More than just a thug, he was a man who made problems vanish. "And if I don't care?" Clint replied coolly. The man's smirk waned a bit. "Then expect to see more of us. And next time, we won't just be knocking." Clint didn't flinch. Stepping closer, he forced the man to back down. "Tell your boss," Clint said, his voice rough like gravel. "If he's looking for a fight, he knows where to find me." The man paused, possibly weighing his words, but something in Clint's steely resolve made him think twice. He turned and walked briskly back to a black car waiting by the curb. As soon as the vehicle drove off, Clint closed the door firmly and locked it. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. He had braced himself for some form of retaliation, but he was ready. Caruso's involvement was more serious than Clint had expected. This wasn't merely a crew of low-tier crooks. This was a powerful man with vast resources. Clint was no longer just up against burglars. He faced a formidable adversary who played to win. His fingers clenched into a fist. Throughout his career, he had portrayed men who stood firm, who resisted when challenged. However, this was no script, no role. This was reality. If Caruso wanted a conflict, Clint Eastwood was ready to engage fully. As dusk fell, Clint noticed the black SUV parked down the street, its occupants obscured behind tinted windows. Having spent years on set observing security and police, he recognized a stakeout. The SUV sat engine off, lights dimmed, unmoved for hours. Clint, standing on his porch with arms crossed, took a slow sip of his coffee, his keen eyes scanning every detail. The presence of the SUV was no coincidence. Its occupants intended to make their surveillance obvious. "Amateurs," Clint muttered. Inside, he turned off the porch light, shrouding his home in darkness. He wasn't about to wait passively for trouble. Retrieving an old flashlight from a kitchen drawer, Clint exited through the back door, sticking to the shadows. His experience directing films had honed his understanding of movement and angles. He knew how to remain unseen, how to manipulate the night to his advantage. Stealthily, he approached the sidewalk near the parked SUV. Just as he neared his driveway, a lighter clicked inside the vehicle, briefly revealing a young man's face. Slicked back hair, hardened look, typical of low-level enforcers who did the dirty work for more formidable figures. Clint stepped into the dim streetlight, making himself visible. The lighter extinguished immediately, and tension seized the SUV's occupants. With calculated slowness, Clint raised his flashlight, beaming it into the windshield. The driver shifted, discomfort evident, but neither man spoke. They merely waited. Clint advanced, his voice calm and steady. "You boys lost." The passenger managed a tense grin. "Just enjoying the view, Mr. Eastwood." Clint tightened his grip on the flashlight. "You got a name?" The man chuckled. "Does it matter?" Clint moved closer, spotlighting the driver's face, causing him to flinch but hold steady. Clint's voice dropped. "Back in my day, we called this loitering, and loitering often led to trouble. I don't like trouble on my street." The passenger leaned in, his smile fading. "We're not here to cause trouble." "Good," Clint replied, edging nearer, his boots scraping the pavement. "Then you won't mind leaving my street." After a tense pause, the driver glanced at his companion, sighed deeply, and started the SUV. "Message received," the passenger said with a mock salute as they drove off. Clint watched the tail lights vanish around the corner. Standing in silence, he listened to the fading engine before returning inside. He didn't need to be a detective to grasp the situation. Caruso was biding his time, making it clear through his men that he was watching, waiting. Clint locked his door, walked to his study, set down his flashlight, and poured a glass of scotch. The night's events weighed on him. He had faced many standoffs in his life, on and off screen, but this was different. This was not scripted. This was real, and Caruso's men had just made a grave mistake. They had made this personal by letting Clint see their faces. Morning light streamed through the blinds in Clint Eastwood's study, casting long shadows. He sat, cold coffee in hand, not pondering the accolades for his defiance nor the incessant calls from journalists. His thoughts were fixed on the previous night's black SUV and its occupants. What concerned him wasn't those men. It was the name thrown his way like a challenge, Vincent Caruso. This man was no minor thug. He was a crime lord who wielded control over swathes of Los Angeles from the shadows, demanding loyalty and instilling fear. Clint had defied him, and now Caruso was signaling his intentions. A knock at the front door drew Clint from his reverie. He answered it to find Frank Delaney, a face etched with the lines of experience and sagacity. "Jesus, Clint, I can't leave you alone for 5 minutes without you making headlines," Frank said as he entered. "Nice to see you too, Frank," Clint responded with a smirk. Frank, a retired LAPD detective and longtime acquaintance, had a deep knowledge of organized crime, despite his retirement. Clint closed the door and gestured towards the living room. "Coffee." Frank declined, opting for whiskey instead. Clint poured the drinks, and they sat opposite each other, the air heavy with unspoken words. It was Frank who broke the silence, his voice low. "I heard about the robbery." "Handled it like it was just another Tuesday, huh?" "Caruso's involvement indeed escalated your situation, Clint," Frank acknowledged, his tone somber as he leaned forward. Clint nodded, his expression stoic. Frank continued, "I've had some conversations with old buddies at the precinct. Your name's popping up in all the wrong circles. The guys who attempted the burglary weren't independents. They were part of Caruso's operation." He typically doesn't dirty his hands with such affairs, but he has people who execute these high-stakes burglaries targeting luxurious homes and valuable collectibles. Clint's gaze darkened. They thought I was an easy mark. Frank shook his head. They assumed you weren't home, Clint. But you've really embarrassed them, and in Caruso's world, that's a bigger sin than a financial loss. Word is spreading fast that you single-handedly took down 3 of his men. Some find it amusing, others see it as a direct challenge. Clint exhaled slowly, placing his glass on the table. I couldn't care less about their challenges. If Caruso has a problem with me, he can come and face me directly. Frank chuckled dryly. That's exactly what I expected you to say. His face then turned serious again. Look, Clint, you're not one to run away, but you need to be cautious. Caruso isn't just some thug. He's a calculated businessman, a dangerous one at that. He won't come after you himself. He'll send others, more skilled than the last ones. Clint leaned back, his fingers tapping the armrest. So, what are you suggesting, Frank? I pack up and retreat. Frank sighed. No, I'm suggesting you strategize. Stay one step ahead rather than just bracing for the next blow. Let me investigate, see if I can uncover his plans. Clint studied Frank, looking for any hint of doubt. There was none. Frank was genuinely here to assist. All right, Clint said after a pause. See what you can dig up. But I'm not leaving. This is my home. Frank nodded. I figured as much. He stood, setting down his glass. I'll reach out to some contacts, try to gather some intel. But Clint, if things escalate, if they come at you with more than just a few goons, I'll handle it. Clint cut him off, his tone resolute. Frank exhaled, a smile tugging at his lips. You really are a stubborn old man. And proud of it, Clint smirked. Frank headed towards the door, then paused. Keep your doors locked, your gun close, and stay vigilant. Caruso won't let this go easily. Clint watched him leave, the door clicking shut. He sat back down, finishing his whiskey. He understood Frank's concerns. Caruso wasn't through with him. The black SUV, the subtle threats, the unnerving message left at his doorstep, all signs pointed to a larger scheme unfolding. Clint had faced countless adversaries on screen, but this was no movie, no scripted conflict. This was as real as it gets, and for the first time in a long while, Clint Eastwood felt invigorated by a challenge truly worth facing. If Caruso wanted a war, he would indeed get one. The night descended again over Beverly Hills, casting deep shadows across Clint Eastwood's estate. The silence outside belied the storm brewing within the criminal underworld. Clint knew Vincent Caruso took no slights lightly. The crime boss had already made his initial move by sending his lackeys to surveil Clint, a clear marker of his new status as a target. But Clint was not one to passively await further encroachments. This time, he would dictate the terms. Inside, he methodically secured every potential entry point, reinforcing windows, checking security systems, and strategically placing an old hunting knife near his favorite chair. Yet, the most crucial act he performed that evening was making the house appear vulnerable. He left some lights on, giving the illusion of carelessness, the porch light flickering, signaling neglect. From the outside, his home seemed like the perfect target, a quiet, affluent residence of an elderly man, seemingly unprepared to fend off intruders. Clint smirked to himself. Let's see if they take the bait. Settling into his leather armchair, his baseball bat by his side and his revolver within reach, Clint was prepared not to kill, but to impart a lesson Caruso's men would not soon forget. For over an hour, he sat motionless, his senses sharp to the outside world, his environment marked by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, at exactly 1:42 a.m., he detected it, the subtle rustling of movement outside. He remained composed, his eyes not straying, his body still as footsteps approached the back door. These men were cautious, avoiding the rookie errors of their predecessors. No broken glass, no loud whispers, no careless movements. This told Clint one thing. Caruso had sent professionals. A metallic click near the side window signaled a lock being tampered with. Then a faint creak from the back door as a skilled hand worked the handle. Clint's grip on the bat tightened, but he remained motionless as the door eased open and two figures slipped inside, their silhouettes faint in the dim kitchen light, dressed for stealth and carrying silent weapons. They quickly swept through the first floor, their flashlights briefly illuminating walls adorned with Clint's cinematic achievements. They were not here for theft. They were here to deliver a message. But Clint had his own message ready. As they approached the living room, Clint subtly shifted, causing a faint creak under his weight. The intruders froze, the gunman instantly raising his weapon, scanning the shadows. His accomplice gripped his crowbar tighter. Clint allowed the tension to build, let their own fears amplify their uncertainty. Then, with calculated suddenness, he slammed the baseball bat against the side table. The noise shattered the silence, and as the gunman turned, Clint struck, swinging the bat with precision, plunging the room into darkness. The intruders panicked. The gunman fired a silenced shot, its sound barely a whisper in the quiet night air. The bullet missed Clint. He had already vanished into the shadows, using their own dread against them. "Where is he?" hissed the man with the crowbar. "Quiet, keep moving," the gunman whispered back. Moments later, Clint made his move. From the darkness, he seized the crowbar wielder by the neck, yanking him backward into the study. The man scarcely struggled before Clint struck his ribs with the bat, a sickening crack echoing through the air as he collapsed, gasping. "What the—" The gunman spun around, but Clint had disappeared. A lifetime of perfecting the art of timing and movement, of knowing how to manipulate a scene, was playing out in real life. Clint was orchestrating the most critical scene of his existence. The gunman, realizing his isolation, tried to retreat, but Clint was quicker. He hurled a chair towards the man's legs, tripping him up and closing the distance swiftly. Clint's bat then met the gunman's wrist, sending the weapon skidding away. The man groaned in pain, clutching his arm. Clint grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "You boys never learn, do you?" The man's bravado shattered, stammering, I was just following orders, man. It's not personal." Clint leaned in, his voice a cold whisper. "It is now." He released the man, letting him slump to the floor beside his incapacitated partner. With measured steps, Clint collected the discarded handgun, ejected the magazine, and scattered the bullets across the floor. He then hauled the burglar up by his shirt, dragging him to the front door. "Get up," he commanded. The man staggered up, aiding his still-recovering partner, as they limped towards the exit. Clint watched them shuffle out. The black SUV was still parked nearby. As the men reached the porch, the SUV's back door swung open, revealing another shadowy figure inside. Clint locked eyes with the unseen man, understanding the nature of this test. Caruso had not merely intended to intimidate, but to gauge Clint's resolve. Clint stood in the doorway, the gun in hand, its barrel aimed downward. He didn't need to raise it. His message was clear. The injured men hurried into the SUV, which sped off into the night. Clint remained on his porch, watching their retreat. He wasn't sure if they would return, but one thing was certain. If Vincent Caruso approached again, it wouldn't be through hired guns. He would come himself. And Clint would be ready. The night air hung heavy with the scent of gunpowder and fear as the SUV vanished into the darkness. Clint stood a moment longer, his grip firm on the handgun he had wrested from the intruders. His heartbeat settled back to its usual steady rhythm. Though his body ached from the exertion, his mind was razor-sharp. He had just sent a potent message to Vincent Caruso, marked by bruises, broken bones, and shattered pride. Now, it was time to brace for the next assault. Clint stepped back into the house, locking the door behind him. The aftermath of the altercation lay around him: upturned furniture, shattered glass, and the gleaming empty magazines under the dim hallway light. He moved with deliberate patience, placing the gun on the counter and assessing his arsenal: the baseball bat, his old hunting knife, and a shotgun tucked away in the hall closet. While loath to shoot unless absolutely necessary, Clint was prepared to escalate his defenses if pushed. Yet, something nagged at him. Caruso wouldn't resort to another amateur burglary. He had already lost 2 teams to Clint's defenses. The next move would be more cunning, more personal. Clint refilled his glass with whiskey, sipping slowly, his instincts on high alert. Then, a metallic clink sounded outside. Clint set down his glass, tension coiling within him as he moved silently to the window. His keen eyes scanned the front yard. At first, all seemed normal under the soft streetlight glow. But then, a figure near the mailbox caught his attention. A man dressed in dark clothes, face hidden by a hood, seemed to be tampering with something in the dirt. Clint watched as the figure hastily retreated to a vehicle parked down the street. He stepped outside cautiously, approaching the mailbox. Brushing away a thin layer of soil, he uncovered a small metallic object, a bullet casing, alongside a folded, damp note. Unfolding it with steady hands, Clint read the terse message, a clear escalation in this psychological warfare. You should have stayed out of it. Exhaling slowly, Clint's fingers tightened around the note. This wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. Caruso wasn't dealing in mere physical threats anymore. This was about mental dominance. Clint crushed the bullet casing in his palm, tossing it back into the dirt. He had faced threats before, understood the type of men who used fear as a weapon. They thought intimidation was enough to control him. They were wrong. Returning inside, Clint dialed the only person whose advice he trusted, Frank Delaney. Frank picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice light until Clint mentioned the visitor. What kind of gift? A bullet casing and a note. Caruso's losing patience, Clint replied, his voice even. Frank's tone grew grave. That son of a... I knew he wouldn't let this go, he muttered. Clint leaned on the counter, his free hand resting on the bat. What do you know, Frank? There was a pause before Frank spoke. I've pulled some strings. Caruso isn't just angry, Clint. He's embarrassed. You've made him look weak, and in his line of work, that's worse than financial loss. Clint wasn't surprised. Which means he's not done. No, he's not, Frank agreed. Word is he's planning something big. And Clint, listen. You need to get out of there. Clint's face remained impassive. Not happening. Damn it, Clint. You think you can handle this, but Caruso plays by a different set of rules. You don't just win against him. You either fall in line or disappear. Clint's jaw clenched. Then I guess I'll have to rewrite the rules. Frank sighed deeply. At least let me come over. We need a plan. Clint glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. Fine. Get here soon. As he hung up, he moved back to the window. The street was empty now, the earlier car long gone, but Clint knew the night wasn't over. The game had just intensified. Clint knew that the real battle was just beginning. He poured himself another drink, but left it untouched, his mind racing through potential scenarios. Caruso had issued his first significant warning, and Clint was certain that whatever followed would be more severe. However, Clint held an advantage. He had spent his lifetime understanding men like Caruso, portraying them in films, dissecting their motives, and pinpointing their vulnerabilities. And he knew one undeniable truth that Caruso had yet to grasp. Some men never flee, some never surrender, and regardless of age, some men remain formidable. Clint Eastwood was one of those men, and it was only a matter of time before Vincent Caruso realized what that truly meant. The whiskey sat untouched in Clint's glass as he sat at his kitchen table, the note and bullet casing left at his mailbox earlier glaring back at him. A warning, a message, a dare. Caruso was playing a game. One Clint was determined not to lose. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Clint grabbed the baseball bat from the counter before approaching the door, his grip tight. He knew Frank Delaney was coming, but tonight, even an old friend couldn't just show up unannounced. Clint cracked the door just enough to see Frank standing there, his face tense. "You look like hell," Frank remarked as he stepped inside. "And before you say it, I know you don't give a damn," Clint responded, closing the door behind him. "Didn't sleep." Frank sighed. "Yeah, I figured. Caruso's warning shook you." Clint scoffed. "Not me." He picked up the note and tossed it onto the table. "But he's getting bolder, and that means he's getting desperate." Frank sat down, rubbing his face. "I made a few more calls. Caruso's ego is bruised. He's telling his guys that if he doesn't deal with you, it'll make him look weak." Clint smirked. "He already looks weak. That's the problem." Frank leaned forward, his voice low. "That's not the real problem, Clint. The real problem is that men like Caruso don't just go after you. They go after the people around you." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Clint's expression darkened. "Say what you mean, Frank." Frank exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I don't think Caruso's next move is sending more guys to break into your house. That didn't work. He knows he can't intimidate you directly." Frank locked eyes with Clint. "So, what's the next best thing?" Clint's hands curled into fists. "My family." Frank nodded grimly. "I think he's going to send a message, one that hits closer to home. Maybe a scare tactic, maybe worse." Clint's heart clenched in a way it hadn't in decades. His kids and grandkids didn't live under his roof, but they were still his blood. If Caruso thought for even a second that targeting them would break him, he was about to make the worst mistake of his life. Without a word, Clint grabbed his phone and dialed Allison, his daughter. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy. "Dad, do you have any idea what time it is?" Clint didn't waste time. "Ally, I need to know. Has anyone been bothering you? Strange cars? Weird phone calls?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a shift in her tone. "Dad, what's going on? Just answer me. I mean, there was a guy outside my house yesterday, black SUV. Thought it was a nosy neighbor's friend, but now that you're asking..." Clint's stomach twisted, his voice coming out cold. "You still have that security system I told you to install?" "Yes, and I checked the cameras." "He didn't come onto the property, just sat on the street for a while. Did you get the plates?" Allison hesitated. "Dad, what's going on? You're scaring me." Clint forced himself to take a slow breath. "I need you to send me that footage right now." "Okay, but Dad, if something's wrong, you need to tell me." "I will," Clint promised. "Just send me the footage." As he ended the call, he glanced at Frank, his jaw tight. "They're watching her." Frank swore under his breath. "We need to move, Clint. You know that, right? You need to get her somewhere safe." "She's not going anywhere," Clint said, his voice low. "She's got a family, a life, and I'm not letting some thug dictate how she lives it." Frank rubbed his temples. "Damn it, Clint, you're making this personal." Clint gave him a hard look. "It is personal." Frank exhaled, knowing there was no convincing him otherwise. "All right, but at least let me put some eyes on her place. If Caruso's people are watching, we need to watch them." Clint nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Fine. But if they come near her, Frank, I'm not waiting for the cops." Frank knew better than to argue. Clint Eastwood had spent a lifetime standing his ground, and nothing was about to change that now. Just then, Clint's phone vibrated. A message from Allison, video file attached. He opened it, scrubbing through the footage until he found the black SUV. His jaw tightened as he zoomed in on the driver's face. Frank peered over his shoulder. "Recognize him?" Clint's voice was pure steel. "Yeah. He was in the car outside my house last night." Frank let out a long breath. "That settles it. They're escalating, and fast." Clint didn't say anything at first. He simply stared at the screen, memorizing every detail of the man's face. Then he set the phone down and grabbed his jacket. "Where are you going?" Frank asked. Clint walked to the closet, pulling out the shotgun he hadn't touched in years. He checked the chamber, the weight of it familiar in his hands. "To send my own message." Frank stood. "Clint, they wanted my attention." Clint interrupted. "Now they've got it." Frank sighed. "Jesus, you ever think about retiring from this badass routine?" Clint smirked as he opened the door. "What do you think?" Frank shook his head, following him outside. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The night air was crisp as Clint stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the darkness. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. Now it was about family, and God help the men who thought they could take that from him.